You awaken inside a medieval palace chamber. Cold torchlight flickers against stone walls. The air tastes of incense and iron. Every breath feels borrowed. Somewhere beyond the heavy oak door, armored men whisper your sentence, their voices dripping with the satisfaction of those who serve power, not justice. You are a queen, accused, not proven. The world you once commanded now moves without you. You hear the faint clang of a forge in the courtyard below, the sound of iron being shaped into truth. Your confession will be branded into your flesh before sunrise. The silence inside your chamber feels deliberate, cruelly staged, as if the entire castle is holding its breath, savoring your humiliation. Then the door opens. Cut to a sweeping panorama, golden halls, marble floors, crowns gleaming under candlelight. The Europe of romance and chivalry. But beneath the velvet and devotion, something festers, a centuries-long institution that turned love into a crime and queens into examples. Because when a queen betrayed a king, it was never just adultery, it was treason, and treason demanded spectacle. If glimpses like this into Europe's buried nightmares intrigue you, subscribe and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It fuels more journeys into these forbidden archives. Between the 11th and 16th centuries, Europe was a continent of crowned empires. England, France, Castile, the Holy Roman world, where every coronation promised divine order. Behind that glittering illusion, moral control was enforced not through kindness, but through spectacle. The queen's body was more than flesh, it was the vessel of legitimacy, the mirror of a king's divine right. When that sanctity was doubted, the punishments that followed were not random, they were systematic, documented, and staged with surgical cruelty. Royal chronicles, papal letters, and secret court ledgers describe these acts, not as moments of rage, but as policy, deliberate, rehearsed, and perfected through centuries. These were performances designed to terrify nations, the theater of obedience written in human suffering. In the glittering courts of medieval Europe, love was never a private matter. It was governance, a political contract sanctified before God and recorded by men. A queen's smile could forge alliances, her womb could secure dynasties, but her desire, her will, if turned away from the king, became the spark for annihilation. The chronicles record it coldly, the accusations, the testimonies, the ledgers. Systematic, always that word. Each stage rehearsed, each humiliation designed not just to punish but to instruct. The message was clear, no heart, however royal, was above obedience. Eleanor of Aquitaine, celebrated as the most brilliant woman of her age, was accused of conspiring with her own sons against King Henry II. Her so-called rebellion was framed as the inevitable fruit of feminine pride. Chroniclers painted her not as a strategist or ruler, but as a seductress whose ambition had poisoned the throne. For 16 years she was kept in confinement, no chains, just walls, prayer, and silence. Systematic isolation. She emerged an old woman, broken yet alive, a warning that mercy could wound more deeply than execution. Then came Isabella of France, remembered by her enemies as the she-wolf. Married to Edward II, she found herself trapped in a kingdom collapsing under corruption. When she allied with rebels to depose her husband, the punishment she faced was not death, but desecration. Chronicles written decades later by clerics sympathetic to Edward describe her as a devourer of men's souls. Her supposed lovers tortured in public before being disemboweled, their genitals burned before her eyes as proof of her damnation. Historians today see this as propaganda, yet the systematic cruelty rings true to the era's psychology. To strip power from a queen, one had to annihilate her body's sanctity. For rulers, adultery was more than moral corruption, it was treason by intimacy. The queen embodied the dynasty's purity. Her womb carried legitimacy itself. If her loyalty was in question, the kingdom's bloodline, and by extension its divine right, was contaminated. Thus, her punishment had to be theatrical. It wasn't enough to execute her, she had to be unmade. Anne Boleyn's trial in 1536 epitomized this ritualized destruction. The proceedings were staged like a play, the court packed with nobles, foreign envoys, and clerics who whispered her sins like sacred scripture. The evidence was laughable. Glances, words, music. Yet the sentence had been written long before the first testimony. Chroniclers noted that when Anne was led to the scaffold, she carried herself with unnatural calm. She wore gray damask and prayed for her enemies. The sword fell cleanly, systematic efficiency, yet her execution was only the beginning of her punishment. Her symbols were purged from coinage, her portraits destroyed, her name cursed by the same church that had crowned her. This was industrial-scale dehumanization centuries before the phrase existed. In Aragon and Castile, queens accused of adultery suffered quieter, more bureaucratic deaths. They were not executed in squares, they were erased in ledgers. Royal accountants struck their names from property grants, dowries reabsorbed into crown estates. The law called it rectification of honor. In one surviving record from 1447, the notary notes, "Her name shall remain in shadow for the peace of the realm." Systematic erasure. Even monasteries became instruments of punishment. Noblewomen condemned for adultery were not sent to pray for salvation, they were confined as living relics of disgrace. Archaeological excavations in old Spanish convents reveal narrow cells with shackles embedded in stone. The nuns' chronicles speak of penitents who neither lived nor died. Some were walled behind brick partitions, given air holes, food through slits, and the promise of salvation if they endured in silence. The Church called this lifelong confession, but the cruelty wasn't always visible. Much of it was psychological warfare refined over centuries. Accused queens were stripped of attendance, forced to write letters of repentance that would never be sent, made to repeat prayers for the souls of the men executed for loving them. Chroniclers describe one queen who, in her final days, begged for the names of her supposed lovers, only to learn that none had ever existed. It was systematic madness masquerading as morality. Behind every such tragedy stood a council of men who believed they were preserving order. Their records remain, rolls of parchment, dry handwriting detailing every humiliation. 15 women confined, one entry reads, 4 declared barren, 2 repentant, 1 dead by fasting. These were not emotional sentences. They were statistics, maintained with the same precision as tax records, and the economy thrived on it. Each fallen queen meant confiscated lands, new marriages, shifting alliances. The Church collected fees for annulments. Courtiers received gifts for loyal service in exposure of scandal. Sin, repackaged as statecraft. One chronicler wrote bitterly, "The blood of queens perfumes the coffers of kings." At times, these punishments bled into the absurd. In Hungary, a decree demanded that any woman accused of royal adultery must appear before court barefoot, in sackcloth, with her hair unbound, a public symbol of her fall. This ritual humiliation was systematic, repeated across decades and kingdoms. The crowds gathered not merely for justice, but for catharsis, the reassurance that their rulers still held power over desire itself. Yet perhaps the darkest cruelty lay not in execution or imprisonment, but in what came after, the rewriting of memory. The queens who survived became ghosts in their own histories. Letters vanished. Portraits were altered. Family crests removed from cathedrals. In time, the silence became the punishment. Their stories, scrubbed clean of names, survive only as moral fables, the faithless wife, the fallen queen. For centuries, Europe perfected the art of killing without blood. But the machine of morality was not done. It was evolving toward an even colder form of punishment, where public spectacle replaced mercy, and the crowd itself became the executioner. By the late medieval period, these punishments had become part of Europe's moral theater. Kings ruled by spectacle, and queens suffered by it. It was no longer about proof, it was about performance. Every accusation was an opportunity to reaffirm divine order before the people. Court chroniclers in France describe grand processions of condemnation, the accused queen forced to walk barefoot through cobblestone streets, dressed in gray, while priests chanted hymns for her fallen virtue. The crowd threw ashes instead of flowers. Some wept, others laughed, but all watched. The lesson was systematic. Every woman in the realm was meant to feel her fear. One anonymous English account from 1388 recounts a chilling punishment. A noblewoman of high rank, suspected of infidelity with a knight, was paraded through Westminster tethered by a silver chain, not to a guard, but to her own wedding ring, enlarged into a collar. Her sentence was read aloud as atonement through spectacle. She was then confined for life in Barking Abbey. The chronicler ends with a line that still echoes, "She was not killed, but all who saw her learned to obey." Systematic psychological warfare was no less lethal than the sword. By the 15th century, such spectacles extended beyond queens to their attendants, young women, courtiers, even servants who carried whispers of scandal. The Inquisition's records in Spain list dozens of companions of fallen queens, tortured into confessing sins they had never imagined. The interrogations followed a template: isolation, starvation, forced prayer. The confessions, carefully drafted in clerical Latin, read like scripts rehearsed for eternity. And yet, amid this cruelty, a strange contradiction persisted. The same societies that punished adultery with fire and confinement celebrated it in art. Court poets composed verses of forbidden love. Painters depicted Venus and Mars entwined under divine light. The hypocrisy was systematic, revealing the moral schizophrenia of an age that worshipped chastity by destroying women who embodied it. Still, the punishments continued. In the Holy Roman Empire, an edict declared that a faithless queen imperils heaven and earth alike. That decree justified the burning of Anna of Tyrol's portrait, though she had never been accused in life. Her image alone was judged dangerous after her husband's death, proof that even remembrance could be treasonous. For many accused queens, monasteries became tombs without death. Some, like Blanche of Bourbon, wife to Peter of Castile, were starved in remote fortresses under the guise of divine penance. Her attendants were forbidden to speak her name aloud. When her body was discovered years later, chronicles note her bones were folded as though she had died kneeling. That was how they wanted her remembered, eternally repentant. Systematic dehumanization. And yet, beneath the machinery of punishment lay a subtler cruelty. The transformation of fear into policy. Entire bureaucracies emerged to manage moral integrity. The papal curia maintained ledgers tracking rumors among nobility. Spies recorded gestures, glances, secret meetings. The queen's private life became public property, dissected, documented, monetized. Surviving Vatican archives even include formulas for tests of purity involving midwives and priests designed to confirm a queen's innocence. The procedure was not medical, it was psychological torment disguised as science. The women who endured it rarely spoke again. Economically, too, the machine thrived. A fallen queen's estate funded new wars, dowries for loyal daughters, endowments for monasteries. Systematic profit through humiliation. Each ruinous scandal fed the next. And when execution came, it was crafted for eternity. Catherine Howard, barely 20, led to the block under the watch of courtiers who pretended grief. Chroniclers noted her last words, "I die a queen, but would rather have been a beggar's wife." Behind her, scribes recorded the event's every detail, the gown, the prayer, the exact tilt of her head, as if cataloging a relic. To erase her humanity, they had to preserve it perfectly. That paradox, to remember only in order to forget, became the moral signature of Europe's empires. In monasteries across France and Spain, archaeologists have found iron rings set into the walls of cloisters. They were once used to shackle noble penitents, their initials still faintly visible, carved by desperate hands. Each mark a silent protest against systematic sanctity. Even death offered no escape. Some queens were denied burial beside their husbands. Others were entombed in unmarked graves, their epitaphs rewritten to honor their purity through punishment. The chronicles called it redemption through erasure. Pause for a moment. Imagine the silence of those corridors, the flicker of candles before portraits now missing faces, the whisper of prayers muttered by women whose only crime was to have loved imperfectly. This was not chaos, it was order. It was Europe, polished and pious, enforcing its idea of perfection through pain. And yet, for all the meticulous cruelty, it failed. The fear these rituals planted would not die. It seeped into the culture, into art, into the bones of nations. It taught Europe to worship purity and distrust passion. It made saints of victims and monsters of those who dared to live as human beings. By the dawn of the Renaissance, queens still smiled in paintings, still wore crowns, but the chains had merely become invisible. Behind every jeweled veil lay centuries of fear, each tear polished into etiquette. And so, as the candles burned through parchment and confession alike, Europe entered its age of reason, still haunted by the ghosts of the queens it silenced, because history remembers its kings by their victories. But it remembers its queens by their punishments. By the late Middle Ages, punishment had become systematic theater, the choreography of fear perfected across Europe's courts. The crown no longer needed to kill to terrify, it only needed to remind. And the reminders were everywhere, in the whispers of courtiers, in the sermons of priests, in the architecture of castles where every tower cast a shadow shaped like obedience. The horror of it all lay in its precision. These punishments were not the product of chaos or passion, they were the product of administration. Each humiliation was measured, recorded, and approved by royal councils who believed themselves custodians of divine order. In England, the machinery was codified. Royal clerks drafted articles of fidelity that defined adultery not as a sin of flesh, but as conspiracy against the sanctity of blood. The Queen's desire was treated as treason because it blurred lineage, a political contagion. Thus, every act of intimacy became subject to surveillance. Confessors reported to bishops, bishops to kings, kings to God, or so they claimed. Systematic purification. The term appears again and again in ecclesiastical records. It described a ritual through which the monarchy reaffirmed its holiness by annihilating doubt. To cleanse the kingdom, they argued, one must burn the Queen's name. But beneath that divine justification was a darker, more pragmatic truth: control breeds profit. A document from the court of Philip the Fair lists rewards for discoveries of impropriety within the Queen's retinue. Informants were paid in coin or title. The result was a kingdom that cannibalized itself. Courtiers trading gossip for advancement, confessors betraying penitent queens, scribes forging signatures to secure bribes. It was no longer about virtue, it was about surveillance. The private life of the Queen became a commodity. Chroniclers who wrote her downfall often received pensions. Poets who immortalized her sin were granted land. Even the relics of punishment, the clothing, the jewelry stripped before execution, were sold as talismans of royal justice. And yet perhaps the most chilling part was how easily faith sanctified cruelty. The Church did not invent the punishments, but it polished them. Priests preached that divine justice could only be maintained by the suffering of the guilty, even when guilt was never proven. A papal decree from 1310 declared that the sin of queens poisons nations, sanctioning trials whose outcomes were written before they began. Every lash, every confinement, every erasure, systematic mercy through torment. The effect was devastatingly efficient. Within a century, Europe had constructed an invisible machine of fear. Women learned to modulate their glances, their laughter, even their prayers. Daughters were raised to obey first, feel later. The greatest queens of the Renaissance, Catherine de' Medici, Elizabeth of York, Mary of Burgundy, ruled not through power, but through the careful mimicry of chastity. In the palace, silence became a survival skill, and the men who administered this world believed they had perfected civilization. They wrote manuals on decorum, on the art of virtuous governance, never realizing that their morality rested on bones. Pause and consider this. The same parchment that recorded a queen's execution often carried notes on cathedral construction or tax reform. Death and glory, inked by the same hand. The empire's greatest monuments were built on the same logic, that beauty justified suffering. Europe, radiant and devout, had turned cruelty into bureaucracy. But the true revelation came when the system began to feed on itself. Once the machinery of morality was in motion, it required constant victims to sustain its sanctity. When queens grew cautious, accusations shifted downward: noblewomen, courtiers, even servants. The principle remained: to preserve purity, someone must bleed. This was systemic momentum, cruelty institutionalized until it became self-sustaining. Chroniclers describe courts where rumor alone could ignite catastrophe. In Burgundy, a single letter, unsigned, unverified, condemned 2 ladies in waiting to the stake. Their ashes were scattered in the moat to prevent contamination. The chronicler's tone was not horrified, it was admiring. Justice was swift, and the air was cleansed, he wrote. The line between ritual and madness had vanished. By the 15th century, these spectacles had become public events. Execution days were scheduled to coincide with feast days, ensuring attendance. Merchants sold food, minstrels composed ballads, priests blessed the crowd. Adultery trials turned into carnivals, a grotesque inversion of celebration. And yet, the crowds came not for cruelty, but for reassurance. Watching the queen fall was proof that sin had limits, that the system worked. Industrial-scale dehumanization. The phrase belongs to our age, but its roots are older than steam. Medieval Europe understood the economy of fear long before factories. The suffering of one body reinforced the hierarchy of millions. And then came the final evolution, when the condemned became collaborators. Some queens, desperate to survive, turned into instruments of the same machine that destroyed them. They confessed crimes they never committed, blessed their punishments as just, and urged their daughters to remain obedient. Systematic indoctrination. Catherine of Aragon wrote prayers praising her own confinement, believing that silence would protect her child. It did not. Her daughter, Mary, grew into a ruler whose faith was vengeance, the daughter of a queen who died by policy, becoming a queen who killed by conviction. The machine had become eternal. Even after the medieval age faded, its ghost persisted. During the Reformation, pamphlets accused queens of sorcery, witchcraft, seduction, new words for old fears. Executioners changed tools, but not purpose. The guillotine replaced the sword. The logic remained divine. The French Revolution shouted of liberty, but still paraded Marie Antoinette as the whore of Austria before her beheading. Her real crime was not excess. It was embodied femininity in power. Her composure at the scaffold, refusing to weep, apologizing to the executioner for stepping on his foot, was the last rebellion left to her. And Europe applauded. The crowds that once watched queens die beneath stone balconies now gathered beneath banners of freedom. But the instinct remained unchanged, moral order reaffirmed by the destruction of a woman. This is how civilizations sustain themselves when they forget compassion. They require reminders, living symbols of what must never be done, and dying examples of what happens when it is. Through systematic propaganda, systematic purification, and systematic silence, Europe built its golden age upon ritualized degradation. From Eleanor to Anne, from Blanche to Catherine, each queen was turned into a parable. Their bodies became sermons, their punishments, scripture. And in that paradox, the adoration of virtue through the annihilation of those who embodied it, lies the darkest revelation of all. The medieval obsession with purity was never about holiness. It was about control, because when power must prove its divine right, it does not pray, it performs. And in those performances, lit by torches and blessed by priests, an entire civilization learned to mistake cruelty for faith. That was Europe's most enduring invention. Not cathedrals, not crowns, but the systematic deification of suffering. When the candles finally guttered out in those cold stone halls, when the last chronicler folded his ink-stained hands and the whispers of judgment faded into the dust, Europe was left with something it did not expect: silence. The kind of silence that hums in the walls of old castles, in the tombs where queens sleep without names, in the pages of ledgers that record their downfall in the same script used for harvest yields. For centuries, the system they built, this systematic morality, outlived every monarch who enforced it. It shaped the psychology of entire nations, teaching generations to fear desire, to confuse obedience with virtue, and to see a woman's voice as a prelude to chaos. But history has a way of preserving the things we try hardest to erase. Beneath cathedrals and monasteries, archaeologists still uncover the evidence of those erased lives. Sealed chambers, rosaries fused with iron, rings that once belonged to royal prisoners. In the margins of illuminated manuscripts, faint names scratched out, yet visible under modern light. The ghosts remain, not as curses, but as witnesses. And when we read their stories today, not through romance, but through record, we see the chilling symmetry of it all. How every law, every sermon, every punishment was not born from faith, but from fear. Fear of a woman's influence, fear of uncertainty. Fear that love, once uncontrolled, might shatter divine order. That fear built empires. That fear murdered truth. Yet the memory of these queens, Eleanor, Isabella, Blanche, Anne, Catherine, endures. Not as villains, not as saints, but as mirrors. Through them, we glimpse what power becomes when conscience is replaced by ritual, when faith becomes bureaucracy, when morality becomes theater. Their pain is no longer their own. It belongs to every civilization that ever confused control with virtue. Because if history teaches anything, it is this: cruelty, once justified, becomes tradition, and tradition, left unchallenged, becomes law. So when we look at the gilded crowns in museums, or the portraits of serene monarchs, we should remember what lies beneath the varnish: centuries of systemic terror disguised as divine order. The archives endure, those ledgers of misery, preserved with tax scroll precision, waiting for eyes brave enough to read them. If this history stirs something in you, outrage, sorrow, the hunger to know more, subscribe and share where it hit hardest. Together, we'll keep unearthing the truths power tried to bury, and we'll let the silence of those queens speak once more.